A wedding day is supposed to be the happiest moment of a couple's life, a new chapter, a promise of love, and the hope of a shared future. But for Dawn Walker, a 52-year-old mother and grandmother living in Halifax, England, October 27th, 2021 would be the beginning of a nightmare. That morning, Dawn was excited, at least on the surface. She was preparing to marry her partner, 45-year-old Thomas Nutt, to friends and family. The ceremony was a cause for celebration. Dawn had found love again after years of ups and downs, and many hoped she was finally stepping into the joy she deserved. But even on that day, some saw troubling signs. Those closest to her noticed she looked tense, her hands shaking as she prepared to walk into the registry office. Her smile seemed forced, her nerves too deep for a bride simply worried about wedding jitters. She whispered to some that she felt uneasy, as though something was looming over her. The couple married in a modest ceremony and went on to celebrate at the Prince Albert pub in Brighouse, where friends and family gathered to raise their glasses. People toasted the newlyweds. Music played, drinks flowed, and for a moment it seemed like a community was united in joy. Yet, throughout the night, Dawn appeared distracted. She was not radiant with happiness. Instead, she looked restless, anxious, fearful even. Later that evening, the newlyweds left the pub. A taxi dropped them off at their home on Shirley Grove at 10:30 p.m. CCTV cameras captured Dawn entering the house at 10:36 p.m. That short clip, a bride in her wedding dress, walking to her home, would be the last time she was ever seen alive. What happened over the next few hours would shock not only her family but the entire nation. Her new husband, Thomas Nutt, the man who vowed to love and protect her, would later be convicted of her brutal murder. And the disturbing part of this story is that the warning signs had been there all along. Welcome. I'm the archivist, and this is True Crime Stories, pulling threads of truth from the darkest knots. Here we preserve the record, dust off forgotten files, and follow the evidence wherever it bleeds. No rumors, no fluff. Just a case, the victims and the facts that refuse to stay buried. Welcome to the case of Dawn Walker. To understand the heartbreak of this case, you first need to know who Dawn Walker was. She wasn't just a name in the headlines. She was a mother, a grandmother, a neighbor, and a friend. Dawn was 52 years old when she walked down the aisle that October day. She was a mother of 3 and a grandmother of 3, roles she cherished deeply. Family was everything to her. Her children described her as someone who would give her last dollar away, even if she was struggling herself. One of her daughters, Cody, recalled a story about her mother paying for a disabled man's shopping when he couldn't afford it. That small act of kindness captured exactly who Dawn was. Generous, thoughtful, and compassionate. Neighbors in Lightcliff, a quiet village near Halifax, knew Dawn as warm and approachable. When she moved into her 3-bedroom house on Shirley Grove, she made an effort to fit in with the community. She even organized a cookout just weeks after moving in, wanting to bring neighbors together, whether through selling Avon or Tupperware products or just chatting with locals. Dawn always found a way to connect. Her family said she was the kind of person who never missed a birthday. Whether you were a close friend or a distant acquaintance, Dawn would pick up the phone to wish you well. These little gestures made people feel seen, remembered, and valued. But behind the big smile and the friendly demeanor, Dawn carried struggles of her own. She had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression. Some days were harder than others. Yet, those close to her said she never let those challenges take away from her kindness. If anything, they made her even more empathetic to the struggles of others. Friends described her as someone with a beautiful soul, always full of energy. Her presence filled a room. Children and grandchildren lit up around her. In her daughter's words, she was my best friend. For the people of Lightcliff, she was more than a neighbor. She was the heart of the street. That's why, when tragedy struck, the community responded in kind. After Dawn's death, neighbors raised £5,000 for her funeral, a testament to how much she meant to those around her. They remembered not just the victim of a crime, but the kind, generous woman who had touched their lives. The story of Dawn Walker's final years can't be told without understanding the man she chose to marry, Thomas Nutt. Dawn met Thomas sometime in late 2018 or early 2019. On the surface, he was charming, attentive, and seemingly eager to build a future with her. To a woman who valued companionship and family, he seemed to offer stability. Within months, the relationship moved quickly. Nutt was living with her at the Shirley Grove home, and to those watching from the outside, it looked like Dawn had found a partner to share her life with. But those closest to her soon noticed things were not right. Arguments broke out regularly. Neighbors heard shouting, slamming doors, and tension spilling into the quiet suburban street. Her daughter, Kiralee, recalled that after Nutt came into their lives, the atmosphere at home changed almost immediately. Dawn, once bubbly and open, seemed to walk on eggshells. What many did not know then was that Thomas Nutt had a violent history going back decades. At just 17 years old, he was convicted of causing grievous bodily harm. During the 1990s, he served long prison sentences for robbery. In the early 2000s, he was jailed again for deliberately crashing into a woman's car during an argument. Between 2005 and 2015, he was in a relationship with another woman, Kimberly Alcock. They had 3 children together. Kimberly later testified that at first, Thomas seemed kind, but shortly after their first child was born, his behavior turned violent. She described terrifying assaults, being pinned down, beaten, and choked until she thought she would die. She secured restraining orders, but even those didn't stop his harassment. She said Thomas was like Jekyll and Hyde, sweet one moment, a monster the next. Dawn knew of his past, but still gave him a chance. She wanted to believe in love, in the possibility of someone changing. Unfortunately, the cycle repeated itself. In 2020, neighbors began noticing visible injuries on Dawn's face. Cuts, bruises, and swelling that she brushed off with excuses. Behind closed doors, she confided to friends that Nutt's temper was escalating. In August 2020, the violence nearly cost Dawn her life. She told someone close to her that Nutt had almost killed her during one attack. He was arrested, but like so many times before, Dawn later retracted her statement and charges were dropped. Out of fear, loyalty, or hope that things would improve, she stayed. By 2021, the warning signs were flashing bright red. Just 2 months before the wedding in August, a neighbor heard Dawn shouting for help and claiming Nutt had broken her ribs. Again, Nutt was arrested, and again, Dawn pulled back from pressing charges. Each time the system failed to intervene, his control over her grew stronger. Friends would later say that Dawn wanted love so badly. She convinced herself things would change. But those close to her, including Nutt's ex-partner Kimberly, tried to warn her. Kimberly told Dawn plainly, "He will kill you one day. Get out." It was a warning that tragically would come true. October 27th, 2021 should have been a day of joy. For Dawn Walker, it was her wedding day. After years of challenges, she had found someone to stand beside her at the altar. Friends and family gathered in Halifax to witness Dawn marry Thomas Nutt at the local registry office. On the surface, it was the happy occasion she had long dreamed of. Guests smiled for photos, raised glasses and toasts, and celebrated at the Prince Albert pub in Brighouse. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. Those who loved Dawn noticed her unease. Her hands trembled as she lifted her glass, her smile tight, her body languid, anxious. To some, she seemed nervous, just a bride overwhelmed by the significance of the day. But others saw deeper worry. This was not excitement. This was fear. One neighbor later recalled that Dawn looked like she was simply going through the motions. Throughout the evening, guests celebrated. Music played, people danced, and laughter echoed through the pub. But Dawn's mind appeared elsewhere. She looked distracted, withdrawn, like a woman carrying a secret she couldn't speak aloud. In hindsight, those moments were warnings, signals that the people around her tragically missed. At around 10:30 p.m., the newlyweds called a taxi and made the short trip home to Shirley Grove. The cab driver later noted how quiet the ride was. No jokes, no conversation. Not even the light-hearted joy expected from two people just married. He described the atmosphere as heavy, tense, almost as if something unspoken lingered in the air. At 10:36 p.m., CCTV cameras captured Dawn walking into her house. In the grainy footage, she appears composed but distant, stepping into what should have been her marital home. That single image became the last proof of Dawn alive. Hours later, her life would be taken by the very man she had just promised to love. Neighbors reported hearing noises later that night. Thuds, crashes, something unsettling coming from inside 33 Shirley Grove. But what struck them most was the silence. No shouting, no screaming, no words at all. It was as if only one person in that house was making noise, and the other had already been silenced. By morning, Dawn Walker was gone. What had begun as a wedding day ended in murder. She had been a bride for less than 12 hours before becoming a victim, and the man she married, Thomas Nutt, would already be planning how to cover up what he had done. After Dawn Walker was killed on her wedding night, Thomas Nutt wasted no time in creating a web of lies. Rather than admitting what he had done, he began an elaborate cover-up to disguise the truth. In the immediate hours after her death, Nutt hid Dawn's body inside a cupboard in their home. While family members and neighbors were completely unaware, he was already thinking about how to buy himself time. At 1 o'clock in the morning, he used Dawn's phone to send text messages to her daughter. The messages pretended to be from Dawn, but to those who knew her well, the tone was all wrong. They weren't her words. They weren't her style. It was obvious something was off. The deception didn't stop there. Later that same day, Nutt washed his clothes, hanging them outside to dry as if nothing had happened. CCTV cameras would later show him going about household chores in the hours following killing. It was chillingly ordinary behavior, masking an extraordinary crime. By October 31st, just a few days later, the pressure was closing in. Police were preparing to search the house, and suspicions were mounting. Nutt knew he couldn't keep Dawn's body inside the cupboard any longer. That afternoon, CCTV footage captured him dragging a large suitcase through his backyard. Inside that suitcase was Dawn's body. Neighbors saw him acting strangely with the bag, one even calling the police with a tip. Hours later, Dawn's remains were found dumped in bushes near Aysgarth Avenue, not far from their home. The gruesome discovery ended the speculation of whether Dawn was truly missing. She was dead, discarded by the very man who claimed to love her. And even as this was happening, Nutt continued his act. He called police to report Dawn as missing, pretending to be a concerned husband. He went as far as taking her daughter, Kira Lee, and her young child out searching for Dawn, all while knowing she was dead. In a heartbreaking detail, Kira later recalled being inside her mother's house feeding her son, while Dawn's body was hidden just meters away in the cupboard. Nutt's performance was manipulative and cruel. He installed Halloween decorations around the house, sent messages in Dawn's name, and carried himself as though nothing was wrong. But forensic evidence, eyewitness accounts, and that suitcase footage told a different story. By October 31st, police had enough to act. Thomas Nutt was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife, just 4 days after their wedding. By the time Thomas Nutt stood trial in July 2022, investigators had already built a strong case against him. The story he had tried so carefully to construct of a missing wife, of a supposed honeymoon trip, of text messages that were never hers, began to fall apart in the cold light of evidence. The autopsy on Dawn Walker revealed the horrifying truth. She had sustained serious injuries to her neck consistent with strangulation. Experts testified that the force used was extreme and that the attack was prolonged. There were also defensive wounds, showing that Dawn had tried desperately to fight back, but her smaller frame stood no chance against a man much stronger. Some of her bones were broken, injuries that prosecutors argued happened as Nutt attempted to conceal her body in a suitcase. CCTV footage was a devastating piece of evidence. Jurors were shown clips of Dawn walking into her home on her wedding night, the last images of her alive. Days later, those same cameras captured Nutt dragging the heavy suitcase across his yard, moments before Dawn's body was discovered in nearby bushes. The prosecution also introduced messages from Dawn's phone. The texts that Nutt sent in her name were clumsy imitations. Friends and family testified that they immediately knew something was wrong. Dawn's daughter said plainly, "It didn't sound like my mom. It wasn't her." But what truly shocked the courtroom was Nutt's history. Witnesses, including his ex-partner Kimberly Alcock, recounted years of abuse and violence. She described how he choked her until she thought she would die, how he controlled her, stalked her, and terrorized their children. Her testimony painted a picture of a man who had been violent for decades, a man who, in her words, hated women and turned into someone unrecognizable when angry. Neighbors and friends also gave statements. They recalled Dawn showing up with black eyes, swollen lips, and cuts across her face. Each time, she explained them away. Each time, she seemed to shrink a little more under his control. And each time, those close to her grew more concerned, until the day came when their worst fears were realized. The defense attempted to argue that Nutt had lost control in a moment of passion, claiming that Dawn had told him she wanted a divorce just hours after their wedding. They argued this was not premeditated murder, but a crime of sudden rage. But the prosecution dismantled that argument. They pointed to his behavior immediately after the killing. The false texts, the concealment of her body, the lies to police, the Halloween decorations, and the suitcase disposal. None of these actions were the panicked reactions of a man who had lost control. They were the calculated steps of someone determined to hide his crime. After an 11-day trial at Bradford Crown Court, the jury took only a few hours to deliberate. On August 10th, 2022, they returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder. The crowds in the courtroom erupted with relief and emotion. For Dawn's family, it was a long-awaited moment of justice. 9 days later, Nutt was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 21 years before parole. The judge condemned him as a dangerous, manipulative man whose actions had been cruel beyond measure. For many, it felt like the system had finally caught up with him. But for Dawn's family, no sentence could erase the pain of losing their mother, grandmother, and friend on the day that was supposed to mark her new beginning. The guilty verdict brought justice, but for Dawn's family, it could never bring peace. Her children and grandchildren were left to live with the devastating loss of a woman who had been the center of their world. Her daughter, Kira Lee, later said, "I lost my best friend, I lost my mom. My children lost their Nana. There's a piece missing that can never be replaced. She recalled sleepless nights, a constant ache, and the unbearable memory of being inside her mother's house while Dawn's body was hidden just meters away. Her other children shared similar grief. They spoke of the emptiness at family gatherings, birthdays and holidays, events where Dawn's presence had always been a guarantee. Even her elderly mother and extended family described how the joy of daily life had been replaced by constant sadness. The community of Lightcliff also struggled with the aftermath. Dawn wasn't just another resident. She had been a friend to many, a neighbor who remembered birthdays, who reached out to people when they were struggling, who organized cookouts to bring people together. The shock of her death reverberated across Shirley Grove. In a gesture of solidarity, neighbors raised more than £5,000 to cover her funeral expenses. The generosity was a testament to how deeply Dawn had touched the lives of those around her. People who had once shared cups of tea, short conversations at the door, or laughter at cookouts, now came together in mourning. But beyond grief, the case also sparked outrage. How could someone with such a long history of violence have been free to do this again? Why had repeated arrests led to no long-term protection for Dawn? Why had restraining orders, past convictions, and warnings from previous partners failed to prevent this tragedy? Domestic abuse advocates pointed to Dawn's story as a devastating example of how victims can slip through the cracks. Dawn had retracted statements in the past out of fear, loyalty, or love, and the system had let the cycle continue. Experts say this is a common pattern. Victims feeling too unsafe or unsupported to pursue charges, only for abusers to grow bolder with each reprieve. Dawn's murder became more than a local tragedy. It was a warning that the system meant to protect vulnerable people still has blind spots. A warning that without stronger safeguards, others might fall into the same cycle of abuse. For her family, her story has become a mission. They ask people not to remember Dawn only for how she died, but for how she lived. Kind, generous, and loving. They want her name to be a call for action. To speak up, to notice the signs, to believe victims when they say they're afraid. The murder of Dawn Walker is one of the most haunting examples of love turned lethal. It is not only the story of a woman who lost her life at the hands of her husband, but also the story of a system that failed to protect her. Time and time again, the warning signs are there. Police were called. Neighbors heard the cries. Injuries were seen. Dawn herself admitted she was afraid. Yet each time, the cycle reset. An arrest, a retraction, and then silence. And each time, Thomas Nutt grew more confident that he could get away with it. By the time her wedding day arrived, Dawn seemed to know deep down that something was going to happen. She told her daughter, "I think something bad is going to happen to me." Hours later, her fears were realized. The lesson from this case is stark. Domestic violence does not begin with a single explosive act. It builds over time, escalating until it becomes unbearable and sometimes fatal. When victims retract their statements, it is often not because the abuse didn't happen, but because fear, manipulation, and lack of protection leave them with no safe path forward. In the aftermath of Dawn's murder, advocates called for stronger measures to protect victims, for interventions that don't rely solely on the victim pressing charges, for communities to take concerns seriously, and for authorities to act decisively when patterns of violence are clear. But beyond legal reforms, there is a lesson for all of us: to listen, to believe, and to support those who may be suffering in silence. A neighbor's concern, a friend's persistence, or a family member's intervention can sometimes mean the difference between life and death. For Dawn's family, the pain will never fade, but they have asked that people remember her not for the way she died, but for the way she lived. As a kind, generous, loving woman who gave more than she had, who made others feel valued, and who was deeply loved in return. So as we close this story, remember Dawn Walker, not as a headline, but as a mother, a grandmother, a neighbor, and a friend. And let her legacy be a reminder. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, speak out. Seek help and don't wait. This is True Crime Stories. If you found this video insightful, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments, what do you think needs to change to better protect people like Dawn? I always read your responses. And together we can continue to shine a light on cases that must never be forgotten.